My wife said she slept with someone else. I asked, "Who's the lucky guy?" I was cutting into my steak when Cindy started crying at our anniversary dinner. She'd planned this whole thing months ago at the fancy steakhouse downtown, where we'd gotten engaged 4 years back. "I slept with someone else," she said between sobs. I put my fork down slowly and looked at her mascara running down her cheeks. My brain felt like it was buffering like a bad internet connection. "Who's the lucky guy?" I asked. I don't know why that came out of my mouth. Maybe I was in shock because just last week she'd grabbed my hand and put it on her stomach with this huge smile saying she'd missed her period. We'd been trying for a baby for 3 years and things were looking great, but now she looked at me like I'd grown a second head. "Robbie, I fell in love with him," she whispered. The restaurant noise faded out like someone turned down the volume. I stared at the little gift box in my jacket pocket with the pearl earrings she'd been eyeing for months. This whole dinner was her idea. She'd reminded me about it every day this week. "Who is he?" I managed to ask. She shook her head hard and wiped her eyes with the fancy cloth napkin. "I can't tell you. I need to protect him." We left without finishing our food. The drive home was dead silent except for her sniffling. I dropped her at our apartment and drove straight to my best friend James's place. He opened the door in his boxers, eating cereal at 10 at night like always. "Dude, you look like death," he said, letting me in. I told him everything while he sat there with his Lucky Charms getting soggy. When I finished, he ran his hand through his messy hair and sighed. "Man, I had a feeling something was up, but I didn't want to say anything without proof," he said. "You should check out that Isaiah guy she works with. They're always getting lunch together." The thing was, I actually knew Isaiah's sister Marielle from college. We'd stayed friends, and she was always posting pictures of her brother on Facebook. I messaged her that night asking if anything was going on between Isaiah and Cindy. She called me immediately. "Oh, honey, no way," Marielle laughed. "Isaiah's been with his boyfriend Carlos for like 2 years. He's just not out at work yet because of all the conservative people there." She paused, then added something that made my stomach drop. "If you really want to know who she's been seeing, just check whose Instagram story she watches first. That little circle always shows up at the beginning for whoever you interact with most." Cindy was already asleep when I got home. Her phone was charging on the nightstand like always. We knew each other's passwords because we'd never had trust issues before. My hands were shaking as I opened Instagram and clicked on the stories. The first face that popped up made me want to throw the phone across the room. Brad Wire, the guy who made my life hell all through high school. The one who shoved me into lockers and called me names I won't repeat. He was some hotshot real estate agent now with the fake smile and the slicked back hair. The next day I drove to his office. The receptionist said he was showing a house, but I waited in the parking lot for 2 hours until his stupid BMW pulled up. He saw me and his face went white. "Robbie, we need to talk," he said before I could even say anything. We sat in his office that smelled like too much cologne. He kept fidgeting with his stupid expensive watch. "Look, what's happening with Cindy is messed up," he said. "I'm done with it. No one deserves what she's doing to you." "What are you talking about?" My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might explode. Brad pulled out his phone and showed me text messages, screenshots of conversations between Cindy and other numbers. My vision got blurry as I read them. She'd been with multiple guys. Not just Brad, but at least 6, maybe 7 others from what I could see. The messages went back 2 years. "There's something else," Brad said quietly. "Those pregnancies you guys kept losing? They weren't miscarriages, man." The room started spinning. 3 years we'd been trying for a baby. 3 times she'd gotten pregnant. 3 times she'd come home crying saying she'd lost it. I'd held her each time while she sobbed into my chest. "She never knew whose it would be," Brad continued. "She told me she couldn't risk it. She's been going to this fertility clinic outside the city, Dr. Wire." I stumbled out of his office and threw up in the parking lot. When I got home, Cindy was on the couch with her laptop. She looked up with red eyes. "Dr. Wire called," she said. "The fertility specialist. She says the procedures might have caused scarring. I might not be able to have kids anymore." I stared at her laptop screen, at the notes she'd been typing about fertility treatments, and something inside me just shut down. My hands went numb. I walked past her without saying anything and went straight to the bedroom, closed the door and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark. The pearl earrings were still in my jacket pocket, digging into my leg through the fabric. I pulled them out and looked at them under the streetlight coming through the window. $200 I'd saved up over 3 months, sneaking 20 here and 40 there from my paycheck. She'd pointed them out at the jewelry store back in August, said they reminded her of her grandmother's pearls. I shoved them back in my pocket and grabbed my keys. Cindy was still on the couch when I walked back through the living room. She looked up at me with those red eyes and opened her mouth to say something, but I was already out the door. I sat in my car in the parking lot for maybe an hour, just gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white and started aching. Every time I tried to think about what to do next, my brain just skipped like a scratched CD. The engagement dinner kept playing in my head, how she'd smiled when I got down on one knee at that same steakhouse, how the whole restaurant had clapped. 4 years ago, she'd said yes and cried happy tears, and tonight she'd cried different tears while telling me she fell in love with someone else. The worst part was how she'd planned it all. She reminded me about the anniversary dinner every single day this week. Monday morning over coffee, Tuesday night while we watched TV. Wednesday, she'd texted me at work just to make sure I remembered. She'd circled the date on the kitchen calendar in red marker. All that planning just to blow up our marriage at the exact spot where it started. I finally started the car because I couldn't go back inside that apartment. Not yet. Maybe not ever. James's apartment was across town in the older part of the city, where rent was cheaper, and the buildings all had that worn-down look. I'd been there a million times over the years, knew exactly which parking spots had the fewest potholes, which door buzzer actually worked. He opened the door in his boxers, eating Lucky Charms straight from the box, which was so perfectly James that I almost laughed. His hair was sticking up in 5 different directions, and he had milk on his chin. He took one look at my face, and his smile disappeared. He put the cereal box down on the table by the door and stepped back to let me in. I walked past him into the living room and just stood there staring at his TV playing some cooking show on mute. My brain still felt like it was buffering, like I couldn't quite process what had happened. James closed the door and came over, grabbed my shoulder and steered me toward the couch. I sat down and he sat in the chair across from me, waiting. I told him everything. About the confession at dinner, about her crying and saying she fell in love with someone else, about how she wouldn't tell me who because she needed to protect him. The words came out flat and weird, like I was reading someone else's story out loud. James sat there with his cereal box in his lap, not eating, just listening. When I got to the part about her refusing to say who it was, he leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. His face got this hard look I'd only seen a few times, like when his dad died or when his ex-girlfriend keyed his car. I finished talking and we just sat there in silence for a minute. The cooking show kept playing on the TV, some chef chopping vegetables really fast. James ran his hand through his messy hair and sighed, which made it stick up even worse. He said we needed to figure out who this guy was, that we couldn't just let her hide it. The way he said it made something shift in my chest, like I'd been waiting for someone to tell me it was okay to be angry instead of just sad. James started listing possibilities, guys from Cindy's work that she mentioned a lot. There was this one guy, Isaiah, who she was always getting lunch with, always talking about how funny he was or how he helped her with some project. The more James talked about it, the more it made sense in this horrible way. I remembered all the times she'd come home and told me about her day with Isaiah, how they'd grabbed sandwiches at that place by her office, how he'd made her laugh so hard she'd spit out her coffee. I'd thought it was nice that she had a friend at work. I'd been happy she wasn't lonely during the day. Now every memory felt poisoned, like I was looking at pictures of my life through a different lens and seeing things I'd completely missed. James kept talking, but I was already pulling out my phone. I knew Isaiah's sister Marielle from college. We'd been in the same dorm freshman year and stayed friends on Facebook. She was always posting pictures of her brother, family stuff, holiday photos. I sent her a message right there from James's couch, trying to keep it casual but direct. Asked if she knew anything about Isaiah and Cindy, if there was something going on between them. I hit send and stared at the screen, watching the little dots appear and disappear as she typed. My heart was pounding, so hard I could feel it in my throat. James was saying something about checking Cindy's social media, but I wasn't really listening. The dots appeared again, and then my phone started ringing. Marielle's name lit up the screen. I answered, and Marielle's voice came through immediately, concern making it higher than normal. She said there was no way it was Isaiah, absolutely no way. I felt this weird mix of relief and disappointment, like I'd wanted an answer even if it was a bad one. She explained that Isaiah had been with his boyfriend Carlos for like 2 years, that they lived together in an apartment downtown. He wasn't out at work yet because of all the conservative people there, so he kept his personal life really private. I'd had no idea. Cindy had never mentioned that part, probably because Isaiah never told her. Marielle paused and I could hear her moving around, maybe pacing. Then she said something that made my stomach drop straight through the floor. She told me to check whose Instagram story Cindy watches first, that the little circle at the beginning always shows whoever you interact with most. It's this thing with the algorithm, how it tracks who you care about based on whose content you view. I thanked her and hung up, my hands already shaking. James was staring at me asking what she said, but I was already thinking about Cindy's phone sitting on the nightstand at home, plugged in like always. We'd always known each other's passwords, never had any reason to hide anything. That was going to change tonight. I drove back home around 2 in the morning when I was sure Cindy would be deeply asleep. She'd always been a heavy sleeper, could sleep through anything once she was out. I parked in our usual spot and sat there for another 10 minutes, building up the nerve to go inside. The apartment was dark except for the bathroom nightlight we kept on. I could hear Cindy's breathing from the bedroom, that deep rhythm that meant she was completely gone. I walked in as quietly as possible, avoiding the spots on the floor that creaked. Her phone was right where I knew it would be, plugged into the charger on her nightstand. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped it twice while typing in her password, the same password we'd always shared because we never had trust issues before tonight. The screen lit up and I backed out of the bedroom, went to the living room and sat on the couch in the dark. I opened Instagram and my thumb hovered over the stories icon at the top. Part of me didn't want to know, wanted to just put the phone back and pretend this wasn't happening, but I clicked it anyway. The first face that appeared in that little circle made me want to throw her phone through the window. Brad Wire, the guy who'd made my life hell all through high school. The one who'd shoved me into lockers, who'd called me every name in the book, who'd made me dread going to the school every single day for 4 years. His face was right there with his fake real estate agent smile and his slicked back hair, looking exactly like he had in high school except older and more polished. I sat there on the couch in the dark, staring at his face on that tiny screen, and I felt like I was 17 again and completely powerless. I couldn't sleep after that, didn't even try. I just sat there on the couch scrolling through Brad's Instagram profile, looking at his perfect life. Photos of him in suits standing in front of houses with sold signs, pictures of his stupid BMW, shots of him at fancy restaurants and golf courses. Every single photo felt like another punch to the gut. The captions were all the same fake motivational garbage about success and grinding and making your dreams happen. I kept thinking about how Cindy knew everything Brad had done to me in high school. She knew about the lockers and the names and the time he'd tripped me in the cafeteria, so I'd spilled my lunch everywhere. I'd told her all of it when we first started dating, when we were sharing our worst memories and childhood traumas. She'd held my hand and said she was sorry I'd gone through that Brad sounded like a terrible person, and then she'd gone and fallen in love with him anyway. She'd chosen him over me, protected him, refused to tell me his name because she needed to keep him safe. The sun started coming up and I was still sitting there, still scrolling through his profile, still feeling like that scared kid in high school who couldn't fight back. Cindy's alarm went off in the bedroom, but I didn't move. I heard her get up and shuffle to the bathroom. She came out to the living room and stopped when she saw me on the couch. Asked if I'd been there all night, if I was okay. I told her I couldn't sleep, that I was coming down with something. She bought it, or pretended to, and went to make coffee. I watched her move around the kitchen and wondered how I'd never seen it before, how good she was at lying. I called in sick to work that morning. Told my boss I had food poisoning or the flu or something. I don't even remember what I said. Cindy left for her job around 8, and I waited until I heard her car pull out of the parking lot. Then I took a shower for the first time in 24 hours and got dressed. Didn't shave, didn't care. I looked in the mirror and barely recognized myself. My eyes were red and puffy, my face was pale. I looked like I'd aged 5 years overnight. I got in my car and drove straight to Brad's real estate office without really thinking about what I was going to say or do. His office was in this nice building downtown, all glass and steel and expensive looking. There was a receptionist at the front desk, young woman with perfect makeup and a fake smile. She asked if I had an appointment and I said no, that I needed to see Brad Wire. She checked her computer and told me he was out showing a house but should be back in an hour or so. I told her I'd wait. She looked uncertain but pointed to some chairs in the lobby. I sat down and stared at the wall, at the framed photos of successful sales and happy families in their new homes. 2 hours went by. The receptionist kept glancing at me nervously, probably wondering if she should call security. Then Brad's BMW pulled into the parking lot. I watched him through the window as he got out, checking his phone and adjusting his tie. He looked up and saw me sitting there and his face went completely white. Brad walked toward the building and I stood up, moved toward the door. We met in the parking lot and he stopped a few feet away from me. The first words out of his mouth were that we needed to talk. Not an apology, not an excuse, just that flat statement. I wanted to punch him right there in the parking lot, but I didn't. Just stared at him, waiting. He gestured toward the building and started walking, assuming I'd follow. I did. We went through the lobby, past the nervous receptionist, and into his office. It smelled like too much cologne, that expensive kind that guys wear when they're trying too hard. He closed the door and sat down at his desk, but I stayed standing. He kept fidgeting with his watch, this big flashy thing that probably cost more than my car. I could see sweat on his forehead even though the office was cool. He looked nervous, which made me feel slightly better. At least I wasn't the only one who was scared. I crossed my arms and just looked at him, not saying anything, waiting for him to explain why he'd been sleeping with my wife. The silence stretched out for maybe 30 seconds that felt like an hour. Then he started talking. Brad pulled out his phone before I could even ask a question. He said what was happening with Cindy was messed up, that he was done with it, that no one deserved what she was doing to me. I was confused about why he was being so cooperative, why he wasn't defensive or angry. He started showing me screenshots of text messages and my confusion got worse. These weren't just messages between him and Cindy. There were conversations with other numbers, other names I didn't recognize. He scrolled through them quickly, explaining as he went. Said he'd started to realize a few weeks ago that he wasn't the only one, that Cindy had been talking to multiple guys the same way she talked to him. He'd confronted her about it and she'd admitted there were others, but she wouldn't say how many or who they were. So he'd started digging, piecing together information from things she'd said, from her social media, from mutual friends. He'd found at least 6, maybe 7 other guys besides himself. My vision got blurry as I scrolled through screenshot after screenshot. Different phone numbers, different names, but the same flirty language from Cindy, the same manipulation tactics, the same promises and sweet words. The messages went back 2 years, almost exactly to when we'd started trying for a baby. I felt sick. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped Brad's phone. I kept scrolling, and the phone screen showed conversation after conversation with different area codes and names I didn't recognize. Brad stood next to me, pointing at specific messages and explaining that he'd started piecing this together about 3 weeks ago, when Cindy accidentally sent him a text meant for someone else. He said he confronted her and she broke down and admitted there were others but wouldn't say how many or give names. So he started digging through what he could find, and based on the phone numbers and the patterns in her social media, he figured out there were at least 6 guys besides him. Maybe 7 if you counted someone she'd been talking to recently. The messages went back almost exactly 2 years, and I felt sick realizing that was right when we'd started seriously trying for a baby. Every single conversation showed her using the same words, the same flirty jokes, the same way of making each guy feel special and chosen. She told the gym guy she loved how strong he was. She told someone named Daniel she loved his mind. She told Brad she'd always had feelings for him since high school. The exact same manipulation over and over with different men, and they all fell for it just like I did. I handed Brad his phone back because I couldn't look at it anymore and started walking toward the door. Then Brad said quietly that there was something else I needed to know, and his voice had this tone that made me stop walking. He was fidgeting with his watch again and wouldn't look at me directly. My heart started hammering because whatever he was about to say felt worse than everything else somehow. He took a breath and said the pregnancies we lost weren't really miscarriages. The room tilted sideways and I grabbed the edge of his desk to stay standing. Brad kept talking and explained that Cindy had told him she couldn't risk having a baby when she didn't know whose it would be. She'd been going to some fertility clinic way outside the city, seeing a doctor named Wire who performed the procedures to end them. 3 times over 3 years she got pregnant, and 3 times she went to that clinic and terminated it, and then came home and told me she'd lost the baby. I stumbled toward the door and barely made it outside before I threw up in the parking lot next to his BMW. Some lady walking by asked if I was okay, and I waved her off. I sat in my car for over an hour just staring at the steering wheel, trying to process what Brad had told me. I kept thinking about the first time Cindy came home crying 2 years ago and how I'd held her on our bed while she sobbed into my chest. I told her it wasn't her fault, that these things happen, that we'd keep trying. The second time was 8 months later, and she cried even harder, and I rubbed her back and brought her tea and told her we'd get through it together. The third time was last year, and I took off work for 3 days to take care of her, and we barely left the apartment. Every single time she knew exactly what she'd done and why she'd done it, and she let me comfort her anyway. When I finally felt steady enough to drive, I headed home and found Cindy sitting on our couch with her laptop open. She looked up when I walked in, and her eyes were red and puffy like she'd been crying. She said, "Doctor." Wire had called her with bad news, and that the fertility procedures might have caused scarring in her uterus. She might not be able to have kids anymore, and she started crying again right there. I just stood in the doorway staring at her, and she had absolutely no idea that I knew everything. I walked past her into the bathroom and locked the door behind me. I sat down on the edge of the bathtub and tried to breathe normally, but my chest felt tight. The irony was so dark it almost made me laugh, except nothing was funny. She'd terminated 3 pregnancies to hide her affairs, and now she actually couldn't have kids because of what she'd done. Part of me felt this horrible satisfaction, like she was finally facing consequences, and then I felt guilty for feeling that way. But then I remembered her crying into my chest while I held her and told her it would be okay, and the guilt disappeared completely. That night I told Cindy I was coming down with something and slept on the couch. She tried to be caring and offered to make me soup, but I said I just needed to rest. I had to bite my tongue to keep from screaming at her about everything I knew. I lay there in the dark, making a plan, because I understood I couldn't just confront her without protecting myself first. The next morning I called my older brother Alec and asked if I could come over. When I got to his house, he took one look at my face and pulled me into a hug without saying anything. That's when I started crying for the first time since this whole nightmare started. I told him everything while we sat at his kitchen table. The confession at dinner, finding Brad's name on Instagram, the screenshots of all the other guys, the terminated pregnancies, doctor, Wire, all of it. Alec just listened without interrupting and let me get it all out. When I finished, his face was completely red and I could see how angry he was. He said we needed to get me a lawyer immediately and that he knew a good divorce attorney named Seth Faulkner who handled cases exactly like this. He pulled out his phone right there from his kitchen and called Seth's office. Seth agreed to see me that same afternoon for an emergency consultation. Seth's office was in a nice building downtown, and when I walked in I was surprised because he was younger than I expected, maybe late 30s. But he had this calm and steady way about him that made me feel less like I was going to fall apart. I showed him all the screenshots Brad had sent me and explained the whole situation from start to finish. Seth took detailed notes on a legal pad and asked specific questions about dates and timelines. When I finished, he said I had an extremely strong case for a fault-based divorce and that we needed to start documenting absolutely everything immediately. I drove home from Seth's office feeling different from when I'd arrived. Not better exactly, but more focused, like I had a plan instead of just drowning in all the horrible information. Seth had given me specific things to do, and that helped push back the panic that kept trying to take over. The first thing I did was stop at the bank and open a new checking account in just my name. I transferred half of what we had in our joint savings, which Seth said was fair and legal since we were still married. Sitting in that bank chair signing paperwork felt like the first real step toward getting out, and I could feel my hands shaking less than they had been all week. When I got back to the apartment, Cindy was at work, so I had time to set up the cloud storage account Seth told me about. I spent 2 hours going through every drawer and folder in our apartment, photographing anything that might be relevant. Bank statements showing her spending patterns, credit card bills with charges I didn't recognize, old birthday cards she'd kept from people whose names I didn't know. I felt like a detective in my own home, and it was weird and sad, but also necessary. That night when Cindy got home, I acted normal and asked about her day like everything was fine. She seemed relieved that I wasn't being cold anymore and started talking about some project at work. I nodded and made the right sounds while internally cataloging everything she said in case it became relevant later. After she fell asleep, I waited another hour to make sure she was really out, then carefully unplugged her phone from the charger. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might wake her up as I carried it into the bathroom and locked the door. I sat on the closed toilet lid and started screenshotting everything Seth had told me to document. Her Instagram messages and the order of whose stories she watched. Her text messages going back months. Her email inbox and sent folder. Every few screenshots, I'd upload them to the cloud account so if she woke up, I wouldn't lose everything. It took almost an hour to get through everything, and by the end, my hands were cramping from holding the phone. I crept back into the bedroom and plugged her phone back in, exactly how she'd left it, then went to sleep on the couch again. The next morning, I told her I was still feeling sick and she bought it without question. As soon as she left for work, I got on my laptop and started researching Dr. Wire like Seth had suggested. The clinic's official website looked professional and normal, but when I started digging into review sites, things got darker. One woman wrote about feeling pressured into a procedure she wasn't sure about and how the doctor didn't really listen to her concerns. Another mentioned something about informed consent practices that seemed off. There were enough red flags that I screenshotted all of it and emailed everything to Seth with a note asking if this was useful. He responded within an hour saying it was definitely relevant and he'd look into it further. Over the next few days, I fell into this weird routine of pretending everything was normal while secretly documenting Cindy's every move. I'd screenshot her phone whenever she was in the shower or out running errands. I'd watch her when she didn't know I was looking, trying to figure out what she was thinking. She seemed more anxious as the days went by, constantly checking her phone and jumping whenever I walked into a room unexpectedly. One night, she tried to initiate sex, and I had to make up another excuse about still not feeling great. The hurt and confusion on her face almost made me feel guilty until I remembered what she'd done. I left the room fast because I was afraid if I stayed, I'd say something that would ruin Seth's whole strategy. The thought of her touching me made my skin feel wrong, like I needed to scrub it off. That's when it really hit me that our marriage was over, and had been over since the moment she confessed at that restaurant. I started spending a lot of time just observing Cindy like she was a stranger I was studying. She'd sit on the couch scrolling through her phone with this worried expression. She'd jump when I came into the room. She kept asking if I was mad at her about something, and I'd say no and watch her not believe me. I wondered if she was talking to Brad or one of the other guys. If she was scared, I'd find out more than she'd told me. If she regretted confessing at all or just regretted that I might actually leave her. Alec called me every single day to check in and make sure I was holding it together. He'd ask if I needed anything or if I wanted to come stay with him for a while. He kept saying his guest room was always available whenever I needed to get away. Having someone who actually cared about me and wasn't lying helped more than I could explain. It made the difference between falling apart completely and being able to function enough to execute Seth's plan. A week after my first meeting, Seth called with an update. He'd prepared preliminary divorce paperwork and opened an official case file. He'd also talked to a colleague who specialized in medical malpractice about the whole Dr. Wire situation. We were building a strategy that covered every angle, and for the first time since that anniversary dinner, I felt like I might actually survive this. I made an appointment with the therapist Seth recommended. Her name was Kaylee Freeman, and she specialized in helping people through traumatic divorces. The first session felt awkward because I didn't know where to start or how much to say. But she was patient and asked good questions that made it easier to talk. By the end of the hour, I told her the whole story from the confession to Brad, to the multiple affairs, to the terminated pregnancies. When I finished, she looked at me very seriously and said what Cindy did was reproductive coercion and emotional abuse. Hearing someone with a degree and professional credentials name what happened to me as abuse felt validating in a way I hadn't expected. I'd been so focused on the cheating part that I hadn't really processed the pregnancy stuff as its own separate violation. Kaylee explained gaslighting and how Cindy had used my trust and grief as weapons against me. She talked about manipulation patterns, and suddenly so many things from the past 2 years started making horrible sense. The way Cindy would cry and make me comfort her after terminating pregnancies that I thought were miscarriages. How she'd get angry if I questioned anything about her schedule or her friends. The way she'd accuse me of not trusting her whenever I had a normal question. It was all part of a pattern I'd been too close to see. That night, I went back through all the screenshots and phone numbers from Brad's evidence with fresh eyes. I cross-referenced them with Cindy's Instagram followers and Facebook friends. I managed to identify 2 more of her affair partners through careful investigation. One was a guy from her gym, whose profile showed him in workout photos she'd liked dozens of times. Another was someone she knew from college who'd moved to our city last year and whose number showed up in her texts way too often. Each discovery felt like ripping off a Band-Aid. It hurt, but it was necessary to know the full truth of what she'd done. I pulled up the gym guy's Instagram profile and started scrolling back through 6 months of posts until I found the photo from that dinner at our apartment. There he was, standing in our kitchen, holding a beer with his arm around his girlfriend, while Cindy laughed at something he said in the background. I zoomed in on her face and saw the way she was looking at him with her hand on his shoulder. My stomach twisted because I remembered that night clearly. I thought she was just being a good hostess, making everyone feel welcome. Now I knew she was touching the guy she was sleeping with right in front of me and his girlfriend. I checked the messages Brad sent me and found the gym guy's number matched one of the conversations. The texts between them went back 8 months, which meant she was with him before and after that dinner. I sat there staring at that photo for probably 20 minutes trying to figure out how I missed it. Over the next few days, Cindy started acting weird around me in a way she hadn't before. She kept asking if I was mad at her about something, and I'd say no while watching her not believe me. She tried starting serious talks about our future and whether I was upset about the fertility news. I gave her vague answers like, maybe we should focus on other things right now, and she'd get this frustrated look on her face. The power between us had completely flipped because now I knew everything, and she was the one in the dark guessing. She'd reach for my hand, and I'd let her hold it while feeling absolutely nothing. One night, she sat me down on the couch and grabbed both my hands with tears in her eyes. She said she wanted us to have a fresh start and really commit to our marriage and move past her mistake. I just nodded and told her we'd work on it. The lie came out so easily it scared me a little because I'd never been good at lying before. But now that I knew the truth about her, the lies just rolled off my tongue like nothing. I felt myself turning into someone I didn't recognize, but I couldn't stop because I needed to protect myself first. Seth called me 3 days later and said we were ready to move forward with separation and filing. He'd prepared all the paperwork and documented every piece of evidence in a way that would hold up in court. He'd also set up a separate bank account in just my name and transferred half our savings into it. We scheduled a meeting at his office to review everything and discuss the timeline for serving Cindy with divorce papers. Hearing him lay it all out so professionally made it feel real in a way it hadn't before. I started moving my important stuff to Alex's house bit by bit when Cindy was at work. My birth certificate and passport went first, then my childhood photos and the things my mom gave me before she died, my high school yearbooks and the watch my dad left me. I took one box at a time so Cindy wouldn't notice anything missing. She was so wrapped up in her own anxiety and guilt that she didn't pay attention to what I was doing. I'd load a box in my car in the morning and drop it at Alex during lunch, then come home like normal. James came over one evening when Cindy was out with her work friends. We sat in the living room and I showed him everything I'd found. He admitted he always thought something was off about her behavior, but didn't want to say anything without proof. He mentioned times at parties when she was flirty with other guys and how she always needed to be the center of attention. Red flags I completely missed because I trusted her. He asked if I was doing okay and I told him honestly I didn't know. I felt numb most of the time, like I was watching my life happen to someone else. My second therapy session with Kaylee hit me harder than the first one. We were talking about the pregnancies and suddenly I just broke down crying in her office. She handed me tissues and let me cry for probably 10 minutes straight. When I could finally talk again, she helped me understand I was grieving multiple things at once. The marriage I thought I had, the future I'd planned, the 3 babies I believed existed. She said the grief was complicated because those pregnancies were real to me, even though Cindy ended them. That's what made it so hard to process. Kaylee taught me about trauma responses and why I'd been feeling so numb and disconnected lately. She explained my brain was protecting me from the full emotional impact all at once. The feelings would come in waves as I processed everything, and that was completely normal. She suggested I start keeping a journal to write down what I was feeling instead of bottling it up. I bought a notebook that night and started writing. It helped more than I expected. I decided to reach out to Daniel since he was one of the affair partners I'd identified through Cindy's Instagram. I sent him a message saying I was Cindy's husband and I knew about their relationship. I told him I wasn't mad at him. I just wanted to understand what happened. I didn't expect him to respond, but he messaged me back within an hour. He agreed to meet me for coffee the next day. We met at a place across town where nobody would recognize us. Daniel looked younger than me, maybe 25, with nervous energy. He kept fidgeting with his coffee cup and wouldn't make eye contact at first. He started talking before I could even ask anything. He said Cindy told him she was separated and going through a divorce, that I was emotionally abusive and controlling, that she needed support during this difficult time. I pulled out my phone and showed him our social media photos from the exact time they were together. Pictures of me and Cindy at the beach looking happy. Anniversary posts, photos from parties with friends. His face went completely pale as he scrolled through them. He put his phone down and said he had no idea. He thought he was helping someone escape a bad situation. Instead, he was the other guy in an affair, and he felt sick about it. Daniel started talking faster like he needed to get it all out. He explained how Cindy would text him constantly for days, making him feel like the most important person in the world, then suddenly go cold and distant. When he'd ask what was wrong, she'd blame him for being too needy or not understanding what she was going through. He said it messed with his head because one minute everything was perfect, and the next he was apologizing for things he didn't even do. The pattern repeated over and over until he finally realized her stories about me didn't add up with what he saw on social media. That's when he ended it and blocked her number. I sat there listening and recognized every single thing he described from the text screenshots Brad showed me. She used the same playbook on all of them. Daniel kept apologizing like he owed me something, but I told him he was a victim too. He didn't know about the pregnancies or the other men, and his face went even whiter when I explained about the terminated pregnancies. He pushed his coffee away and said he felt sick all over again. We exchanged numbers before leaving, and he said if I needed him to testify or provide statements for anything, he would. I drove home in a daze, trying to process everything Daniel told me. Then something clicked in my brain about the timing of those 3 pregnancies. I pulled over into a random parking lot and opened the calendar app on my phone. I started counting backwards from when Cindy told me about each pregnancy, trying to figure out conception dates. My hands were shaking as I cross-referenced those dates with her text message timestamps from the screenshots Brad sent. The first pregnancy she told me about was right after a weekend trip we took to the mountains. But the conception window also overlapped with a week when she was texting Brad constantly and meeting up with him. Same pattern with the second one. The third pregnancy timing matched up with when she was seeing Daniel and at least 2 other guys based on the message history. She got pregnant and couldn't figure out whose it was, so she ended it. Then she'd come home crying and I'd hold her while she sobbed about losing our baby. The level of calculation was insane. She wasn't just cheating, she was playing probability games with pregnancies and using my emotions as cover. I sat in that parking lot for probably an hour just staring at my phone screen. Every time I thought I understood how bad it was, I discovered another layer. My phone rang and Seth's name popped up. I answered and he sounded excited, which was weird given the circumstances. He said he'd finished reviewing all the evidence I'd sent over, and we had an extremely strong case for fault-based divorce. The adultery evidence was overwhelming with multiple partners and a clear pattern of deception. But the reproductive coercion aspect added a whole other dimension that courts take very seriously. He explained that what Cindy did with the pregnancies wasn't just morally wrong, it was a form of abuse that judges really pay attention to. Seth said he was confident we could get a favorable settlement and that Cindy would have very limited grounds to fight us on asset division given her behavior. He wanted to schedule another meeting to finalize the divorce paperwork and discuss our strategy for serving her. I thanked him and hung up feeling this weird mix of validation and rage. At least the legal system would see this for what it was. Over the next few days, I walked around in this strange mental state, trying to prepare myself for the confrontation I knew was coming. Seth wanted to serve Cindy with papers first without warning, but something in me needed to tell her I knew everything before the lawyers got involved. Maybe I needed to see her face when she realized I'd uncovered all of it. I scheduled an extra session with Kaylee to help me plan what I wanted to say. She had me practice staying calm and not letting Cindy manipulate me into backing down. We role-played different scenarios where Cindy would cry or get angry or try to flip things around on me. Kaylee taught me techniques for staying grounded and keeping my boundaries firm no matter what Cindy threw at me. She reminded me that Cindy had been manipulating me successfully for 2 years, so my instinct would be to believe her or feel sorry for her. I needed to remember the evidence and the pattern of lies every time I felt myself wavering. I wrote down key points on my phone that I could look at if I started losing my nerve during the actual conversation. Things like the number of affair partners, the terminated pregnancies, the calculated manipulation. Facts I couldn't argue away or let Cindy explain into something different. I took off work early one Wednesday, figuring I'd go home and finalize my mental preparation before the confrontation. I'd been planning to sit Cindy down that weekend and tell her everything in a controlled way. But when I walked into our apartment, I found her sitting at my desk with my laptop open in front of her. Her face was completely white, and her hands were frozen on the keyboard. She looked up at me standing in the doorway, and I saw pure panic in her eyes. I walked closer and saw my evidence folder open on the screen, all the screenshots I'd saved of her text messages with Brad and Daniel and the others, the timeline I'd created of the pregnancies and affair partners. Everything was right there, and she'd found it all. She started to say something, but no words came out. I felt this weird calm wash over me because the confrontation I'd been planning was happening right now, whether I was ready or not. I pulled out my phone and opened the photos where I'd backed up all the evidence. I started talking in this flat voice that didn't sound like mine. I told her I knew about Brad, and I knew it wasn't just him. I knew about Daniel and the gym guy and all the others. I knew about Dr. Wire and what really happened to those 3 pregnancies. I watched her face go through this whole cycle of expressions. First, she tried to look confused, like she didn't understand what I was talking about. Then panic when she realized I had actual proof. Then I saw her eyes get this calculating look like she was trying to figure out exactly how much I knew versus how much I was guessing. I pulled up one of her text conversations with Brad on my phone and started reading it out loud. The flirty messages, the plans to meet up, the things she said about me. Her face crumbled and she started crying, but I kept going. I read messages from Daniel next, then from another guy whose name I didn't even know until I saw the screenshots. With each message I read out loud, I watched Cindy realize there was no way out of this. She tried to say the messages were out of context at first, that Brad was lying about stuff to make her look bad, that I was misunderstanding what the conversations meant. But I had screenshots of her own words in her own text messages. I showed her the timeline I'd created matching up her pregnancies with periods when she was sleeping with multiple partners. I told her I'd talked to Daniel and he confirmed her manipulation patterns. I explained how I knew about the love bombing and the pulling away and all her tactics. Every time she tried to spin something, I had evidence to counter it. The manipulation techniques that had worked on me for 2 years suddenly had no power because I could see them for exactly what they were. I showed her conversations with the gym guy where she told him I was emotionally distant and didn't appreciate her. Messages with another partner where she said our marriage was basically over. Screenshots where she coordinated meeting times and made up excuses about where she'd be. I told her I knew the miscarriages were actually terminated pregnancies because she couldn't risk having a baby when she didn't know whose it would be. Cindy's crying got harder, and she kept trying to reach for my hands, but I stepped back. I showed her my conversation history with Daniel, where he explained how she'd lied to him about being separated. I pulled up messages between her and other affair partners where she used similar manipulation tactics on all of them. I explained that I'd documented everything and backed it up in multiple places, that I'd consulted with a divorce attorney who confirmed I had an overwhelming case. She finally stopped trying to deny it and just broke down sobbing. She said the messages looked bad, but I had to understand she felt so inadequate and broken, that she needed the attention from multiple men to feel validated and worthy. She admitted she'd been sleeping with different people for 2 years, but claimed she never meant to hurt me, that she loved me but couldn't stop herself from seeking validation elsewhere. She said she had problems she needed to work on, and she knew that now. I stood there listening to her confession and felt absolutely nothing. No anger or sadness or even satisfaction, just this cold, empty space where my love for her used to be. She was admitting to everything I'd discovered, but her words didn't touch me anymore. When she finished her sobbing confession, she looked up at me with red, swollen eyes. She said we could work through this with counseling, that she'd do anything to fix our marriage, that she'd cut off all contact with everyone else and commit fully to us. She grabbed my hands and begged me to give her another chance to be the wife I deserved. I pulled my hands away and told her no. I explained that I'd already consulted with a divorce attorney named Seth, and the papers were ready to be filed. That this marriage was over, and had been over the moment she started lying to me 2 years ago. I told her the evidence of her adultery and reproductive coercion was overwhelming, and she had very limited grounds to fight me on anything. Cindy's face went from desperate to shocked, like she actually believed I'd just forgive her, and we'd move on. She started saying I couldn't mean that and we'd been together for 4 years, that I was just upset right now, but I'd feel different once I calmed down. I looked at her and said I'd never been calmer or more sure of anything in my life. She stared at me for a second like she was waiting for me to crack, and when I didn't, her whole face changed. The tears stopped and her eyes got hard and angry. She stood up fast and started yelling about how I was vindictive and cruel, how I'd been sneaking around behind her back gathering evidence like some kind of spy. I just stood there watching her work herself up into this rage, and it was almost funny how she was trying to flip this around on me. She said I violated her privacy by going through her phone, that what I did was just as bad as what she did, that I had no right to invade her personal space like that. I almost laughed at the absurdity of her trying to make herself the victim after everything she'd done. She kept going on about trust and boundaries and how could I betray her like this, and I realized she actually believed her own manipulation. I looked her right in the eyes and told her I'd see her in court. Her mouth dropped open like she couldn't believe I was serious, and I walked out of the apartment without looking back. I drove to a hotel that night because I couldn't stand being in the same space as her anymore. The next morning I called Seth and told him we were ready to move forward with everything. He said he'd have the papers served within the next few days and that I should start looking for a new place to live. I spent that whole day apartment hunting online, looking at places I could afford on my own salary. Everything was smaller and in worse neighborhoods than where Cindy and I lived together, but I didn't care. I just wanted somewhere that was mine. 3 days later, I was at work when my phone started blowing up with calls from Cindy. I looked at the screen and saw 15 missed calls in 10 minutes, then the voicemail started coming through. I could hear her screaming and crying in the first one, saying how could I do this to her? How could I have her served at our apartment like that? Seth had warned me this would happen and told me not to answer any of her calls or messages. He said now that the legal process had started, all communication needed to go through our lawyers. I blocked her number and felt this huge sense of relief wash over me. For the first time in weeks, I had an actual boundary in place that she couldn't cross. That weekend, Alec came over with his truck to help me move out. We went to the apartment when Cindy was at work so I wouldn't have to see her. Walking through those rooms and packing up my stuff felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life fall apart. I took my clothes, my books, my laptop, all my personal things, but I left the furniture and kitchen stuff behind. Alec kept asking if I was sure I didn't want to take more, but I told him I just wanted to get out with what was mine and start fresh. As we loaded the last box into his truck, I stood in the doorway looking back at the apartment one more time. I felt this weird mix of grief and relief all tangled up together. Part of me was mourning the life I thought I had, but another part was so ready to be done with all the lies. I pulled the door shut and locked it for the last time, then dropped my key in the mailbox downstairs. My new apartment was on the other side of the city, in a neighborhood that wasn't as nice as where Cindy and I had lived. The building was older, and the walls were thin, and I could hear my neighbors through the floor. But it was mine. Nobody else had keys. Nobody else had lived there with me. Nobody else's lies were soaked into the walls. I spent the first few days just existing in the space, not really unpacking or decorating, just getting used to being alone. The quiet was weird at first. No Cindy coming home from work, no sound of her moving around in the other room, no need to perform or pretend or watch what I said. Alec came over with pizza one night and helped me set up my bed. We didn't talk much, just worked together putting furniture together and organizing boxes. I was grateful for his steady presence, for the way he just showed up without making a big deal out of it. After he left, I sat on my new couch in my empty living room and felt this strange sense of peace. It didn't last long, though. 2 days after I moved out, Cindy found my new address somehow and started sending me long text messages. The first one was like 3 paragraphs about how sorry she was and how she'd started therapy and realized how badly she'd messed up. She said she understood now that she had deep issues with validation and self-worth, and she was committed to working on them. The messages kept coming, sometimes 5 or 6 a day, each one longer than the last. When I didn't respond, she started calling from different numbers. I'd block one and another call would come through an hour later. She left voicemails crying about how much she loved me and how we could get through this together if I just gave her another chance. I saved every message and forwarded them all to Seth like he told me to. He said this was classic manipulation, that she was trying to wear me down and make me feel guilty. After 2 weeks of constant harassment, Seth filed for a cease contact order. He submitted all the messages and voicemails as evidence of emotional abuse and showed the pattern of her refusing to respect my boundaries. The hearing happened fast, and the judge approved the order without much argument. Cindy was legally required to stop contacting me directly, and all communication had to go through our lawyers now. The harassment finally stopped, and I could breathe again. My phone wasn't constantly buzzing with her messages. I wasn't jumping every time it rang. The quiet came back, and this time I appreciated it more. I started seeing Kaylee for therapy every week, and those sessions became my anchor. We worked through everything bit by bit, talking about the betrayal and the reproductive coercion and all the ways Cindy had been gaslighting me for years. Kaylee helped me understand that healing wasn't going to be a straight line, that I'd have good days and bad days, and that was completely normal. Some sessions I'd cry the whole time, other sessions I'd just sit there feeling numb. She never pushed me to feel anything I wasn't ready to feel. Slowly, I started to believe that maybe I'd actually be okay someday. Alec and his wife Denise started having me over for dinner every week. They'd make sure I was eating real food and not just living on takeout and cereal. Their kids were a good distraction, running around and playing and not caring about adult problems. Being around their marriage reminded me that not all relationships were built on lies and manipulation. Denise gave me some books about recovering from narcissistic abuse that actually helped me understand what I'd been through. I'd read them at night in my apartment and see Cindy's patterns described perfectly on the pages. During the asset division process, Seth discovered something that made me angry all over again. Cindy had been hiding money in a separate account I didn't know about. There was about $15,000 that she'd transferred out of our joint savings over the past year in small amounts I never noticed. Seth filed a motion for full financial disclosure, and suddenly her lawyer had to produce all her banking records. The judge wasn't happy about the hidden money, and it hurt Cindy's credibility in court. The divorce proceedings dragged on for months after that. Cindy's lawyer tried every delay tactic possible, asking for continuances and filing motions about every little thing. They argued about how to divide our stuff, tried to claim Cindy deserved spousal support, even though she made good money, disputed the evidence of adultery, even though it was overwhelming. Seth handled all of it professionally and kept me updated on everything. I was grateful I didn't have to face Cindy in person for most of it, that I could just let the lawyers deal with each other while I focused on rebuilding my life. The courtroom hearing happened on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks later, and I sat next to Seth at a long wooden table while Cindy sat across the aisle with her lawyer. Her attorney stood up and started talking about how Cindy had suffered medical trauma from the fertility treatments and deserved compensation for the permanent damage to her body. I felt my jaw clench as he painted her as some kind of victim who'd been through hell trying to have our baby. Seth didn't even let him finish before he stood up and pulled out a folder full of documents. He laid out the medical records showing the terminated pregnancies and the timeline of when they happened. He showed the judge the text messages where Cindy admitted to multiple partners and her fear about paternity. The judge's face changed as Seth explained that the scarring wasn't from trying to have a baby, but from hiding affairs. Cindy's lawyer tried to object, but the judge held up her hand and told him to sit down. She looked at Cindy with this expression that made it clear she wasn't buying any of it. Seth kept going and pulled out the bank statements showing the hidden money transfers. He showed the pattern of lies and manipulation that went back years. He argued that Cindy's behavior during the marriage showed bad faith and that she shouldn't be rewarded for her deception. The judge nodded along as he talked, and I felt this weird sensation in my chest, like maybe someone in authority actually saw what had really happened. When Seth finished his argument, the judge took off her glasses and looked directly at Cindy. She said the evidence was clear that the fertility issues were a direct result of choices Cindy made to hide extramarital affairs. She said there would be no special compensation for medical trauma that was self-inflicted through deception. I watched Cindy's face turn red, and her lawyer whispered something to her, but she just stared at the table. The judge ruled in my favor on almost every contested issue. I got to keep the car and most of our savings. Cindy had to pay back the $15,000 she'd hidden. We split the retirement accounts evenly, but everything else went my way. Seth squeezed my shoulder as we left the courthouse and told me this was a solid win. I felt this rush of validation, like finally someone with power had looked at all the evidence and said Cindy was wrong. It didn't fix what she'd done, but it felt like the truth mattered for once. 2 days after the hearing, I met with Lorraine Scott at her office downtown to talk about Dr. Wire. Lorraine was probably in her 50s with short gray hair, and she had this no-nonsense way of talking that I appreciated. I showed her everything I knew about the clinic and the procedures Cindy had done. Lorraine listened carefully and took notes on a yellow legal pad. She explained that if Dr. Dwyer had performed pregnancy terminations without proper counseling or informed consent, there could be grounds for a malpractice case. She said the fact that Cindy had multiple procedures in a short time period raised red flags about whether the doctor had followed proper protocols. I told her about the online reviews I'd found mentioning pressure and consent issues. Lorraine nodded and said those were concerning patterns. We talked for over an hour about what a case might look like and what the goals would be. I admitted I wasn't sure I wanted to go through a whole lawsuit, but I did want someone to investigate the clinic. Lorraine suggested filing a complaint with the medical board as a first step. She said the board took these things seriously and would do their own investigation. Even if we didn't sue, it might protect other people from going through what I did. That made sense to me, so we decided to move forward with the complaint. Lorraine said she'd help me prepare all the documentation and submit it properly. The medical board responded faster than I expected. A month after we filed the complaint, I got a call from an investigator who wanted to interview me about my concerns regarding Dr. Wire's practice. I met with her at a bland office building and spent 2 hours going through everything I knew. She asked detailed questions about the timeline and what Cindy had told me about the procedures. She wanted to know if Dr. Wire had ever contacted me as the spouse or if there had been any couples counseling before the terminations. I explained that I'd had no idea any of it was happening and that Cindy had hidden everything from me. The investigator wrote everything down and said they were requesting all of Cindy's medical records from the clinic. She mentioned they'd received other complaints about Dr. Wire's practice over the past few years. Nothing concrete had come of those complaints before, but the pattern was concerning enough that they were taking a closer look now. Lorraine called me after the interview to say it had gone well. She explained that medical board investigations could take months or even years, but the fact that they were actively pursuing it was a good sign. There was definitely cause for concern based on what we'd presented. I felt a small bit of satisfaction knowing that at least someone was looking into whether Dr. Wire had done things properly. Around the same time the medical board stuff was happening, I started hearing from old friends I'd lost touch with during my marriage. Flynn Hansen was a guy I'd been close with in college, but Cindy had never liked him. She always said he was immature and a bad influence, so I'd gradually stopped hanging out with him. Flynn messaged me out of nowhere saying he'd heard through mutual friends that I was getting divorced. He asked if I wanted to grab lunch and catch up. We met at this sandwich place near my new apartment, and it felt good to talk to someone who knew me from before Cindy. Flynn had gotten married himself and had a kid now, but he was still the same funny laid-back guy I remembered. We started meeting for lunch every couple weeks, and it felt like rebuilding a part of myself that had been missing. Flynn never pushed me to talk about the divorce if I didn't want to, but he was a good listener when I did need to vent. Having friends outside of Cindy's influence reminded me that I used to have a whole life before her. I'd let her isolate me without even realizing it was happening. One Saturday, Flynn invited me to go hiking with him at this state park about an hour outside the city. I almost said no because I'd been feeling tired and unmotivated, but something made me agree to go. We drove out early in the morning and started up this trail that led to a lookout point at the top of a small mountain. The hike was harder than I expected, and my legs were burning by the time we got halfway up. Flynn kept making jokes about us being out of shape, and it made me laugh in a way I hadn't in months. When we finally reached the summit, the view was incredible. You could see for miles in every direction, and the air was cold and clean. We sat on this flat rock eating granola bars, and I realized I'd gone a whole hour without thinking about Cindy or the divorce or any of it. I was just existing in the moment, enjoying the view and my friend's company. It felt significant somehow, like proof that I could still have good experiences and feel normal happiness. Flynn took out his phone and we took a selfie with the valley behind us. I posted it later that day with a caption about new adventures. It was the first thing I'd posted on social media since the separation that wasn't about the divorce. It felt like marking a new chapter, even though I knew I wasn't fully healed yet. 5 months after Seth first filed the divorce papers, we finally reached a settlement agreement. Seth called me on a Wednesday afternoon to go over the final terms. I kept the car, which was paid off, and most of our savings account. Cindy got the furniture from our old apartment and had to pay back the $15,000 she'd hidden in installments over the next year. We split our retirement accounts 50-50, which seemed fair since we'd both been contributing during the marriage. The house we'd been renting didn't matter since neither of us owned it. Seth explained that this was actually a really good outcome given how contested everything had been. Cindy's lawyer had tried to fight for more, but the judge's earlier ruling about her bad faith behavior had weakened her position. I asked Seth how long until it was official, and he said the final decree should be processed within a few weeks. It wasn't a perfect settlement, but it was fair, and more importantly, it was done. I wouldn't have to keep fighting or going to court or dealing with lawyers anymore. The marriage was over legally and financially. I thanked Seth for everything he'd done, and he told me he was glad he could help. After I hung up, I just sat in my apartment feeling this weird combination of relief and sadness. 5 months of my life had been consumed by this divorce process, and now it was ending. The final divorce decree arrived in my mailbox on a Thursday afternoon about 3 weeks later. I stood in my apartment hallway holding the envelope and feeling my hands shake slightly. Inside was the official document with the court seal saying that my marriage to Cindy Montgomery was dissolved. I sat on my couch reading through all the legal language about asset division and debt responsibility. Relief washed over me first because it was truly finished. Then came grief for the life I'd thought I was building and the future I'd imagined with kids and growing old together. Anger followed as I thought about the years I'd wasted believing her lies. But underneath all of that was this tiny spark of something that felt like hope. I was free to start over and build a life that wasn't based on deception. I called Alec and told him the decree had arrived. He said he'd be over in 20 minutes with beer to mark the occasion. When he showed up, he gave me a long hug, and we sat on my couch drinking cheap beer and not saying much. Sometimes you don't need a lot of words. Alec just being there was enough. We ordered pizza and watched a stupid action movie, and it felt normal in a way that nothing had felt normal in months. 6 months after I'd filed the complaint against Dr. Wire, I got a letter from the medical board. My hands were shaking as I opened it because I'd been waiting so long to hear anything. The letter said their investigation had found evidence of improper practices at Dr. Wire's clinic. She'd been performing procedures without adequate counseling or proper informed consent documentation. The board was requiring her to undergo additional training on patient counseling and informed consent procedures. Her practice would be under supervision for the next year, and she'd have to submit to regular audits. It wasn't as much accountability as I'd hoped for. Part of me wanted her license revoked or some bigger punishment, but Lorraine called me after I got the letter and explained that this was actually significant. The supervision and training requirements would be on her permanent record. Other patients could see that she'd had issues with her practice. It might protect other people from going through what I did. That made me feel a little better about the outcome. At least something had come from all of this, even if it wasn't perfect justice. My therapy sessions with Kaylee had been going on for almost 8 months when we hit a turning point. I walked into her office one Tuesday, and she asked how I'd been feeling over the past few weeks. I realized that I'd been having more good days than bad days lately. The constant anxiety and anger that had been my baseline for months had started to fade. I still had moments where I felt sad or angry about what Cindy did, but they didn't consume me anymore. Kaylee smiled and said this was exactly the kind of progress she'd been hoping to see. We talked about how I'd developed healthy ways to cope with stress and how I'd rebuilt my support system. I'd processed the acute trauma and understood the manipulation patterns that had controlled me. Kaylee suggested we move from weekly sessions to monthly check-ins. She explained that I didn't need crisis management anymore, but maintenance and continued growth. The idea of not seeing her every week felt scary at first, but also exciting. It meant I was functional enough to handle things on my own most of the time. We scheduled our next appointment for a month out, and I left her office feeling proud of how far I'd come. I wasn't completely healed and probably never would be. The scars from what Cindy did would always be part of me. But I was moving forward and building a life I actually wanted to live. That felt like a huge accomplishment. 8 months after that therapy milestone, I was grabbing coffee before work when a woman at the counter started flirting pretty hard. She touched my arm and asked if I came here often, and something in my gut said her energy felt off. I smiled politely and moved to wait for my drink without giving her my number. The old me would have felt guilty for not being friendlier, but now I trusted that instinct when something didn't feel right. I noticed these small changes constantly now, like when my coworker Seth tried to guilt-trip me into covering his shift by making up some elaborate family emergency. I recognized the manipulation pattern immediately and said no without the long explanation I used to give. These weren't huge moments, but they added up to feeling more solid in myself, even though I still had days where the betrayal hit me hard and I felt angry all over again. Flynn called me one Saturday and said he wanted me to meet someone. His friend Weston Archer had just moved to the city for a new job, and Flynn thought we'd get along. I agreed to meet them for lunch at this burger place downtown and felt nervous in a way that was different from the anxiety I'd carried for months. Weston showed up right on time and shook my hand with this genuine smile that didn't feel forced or fake. We talked about regular stuff like jobs and hobbies and favorite movies, and I caught myself relaxing and actually enjoying the conversation. Flynn watched us talk and had this pleased look on his face like he'd accomplished something. After lunch, Weston asked if he could text me sometime, and I said yes, but made it clear I was taking things really slow. He nodded and said he understood, and that felt good too because he didn't push or try to convince me otherwise. I drove home thinking about how different this felt from anything with Cindy. Life wasn't perfect, and I still had rough days, but sitting in my apartment that evening, I realized it was mine again, and that was enough for now.